Hey everyone, we're Watch Hags. I'm David.
And I'm Ken.
And as usual, behind the camera, we have our buddy Wilson. Today's topic is a really interesting one. We're going to go back in time a little bit and talk about the history of the wristwatch, stemming from the pocket watch. I think most people aren't aware of how that transition happened. And so today I'm really glad to be able to share that story with you all. Yeah. And so to do that, Ken, you're going to tell us about how that journey happened for you.
Yeah, for sure. So David, you're totally right. If you look back at the history of a device that measured time and how humans used to do that, it basically stems from something we carried in our pocket actually, rather than strapped on our wrist. Something that looks like this. And if you look at history, essentially the first pocket watch was probably invented around the early 1500s. And it took probably another couple of hundred years before it became more commonplace where average people were measuring and recording time with a pocket watch. But it was something like this, and it's a device of such romance, David, because it's something you had in your pocket. It was all manual wiring in those days, so once again that beautiful feedback between the human and the machine. And often as well, like on this one, you've got a device to commemorate stuff. We've been talking about commemorating things. There's an open place at the back for you to engrave special occasions and so on. And that carried on eventually even into wristwatches as well. It took also a few hundred years before the first wristwatch, would come out. I think it was in the late 1700s. And there's a bit of debate whether it was Patek Philippe or Breguet who were the first people who originated wristwatches, but around that time. Having said that, I mean, it would then take some years before a wristwatch will become commonplace. In fact, a couple hundred years more, because wristwatches only overtook pocket watches in terms of manufacture in volume around the end of the Great Depression. And commonplace for a wristwatch to be used rather than a pocket watch was probably only in the start of the Second World War.
So why do you think it switched from a 300-400-year-old design of a pocket watch to a wristwatch?
Well, David, it was really about functionality, right? I think that the pocket watches were popular because people were wearing formal suits, nice waistcoat like you are wearing today. You could put it nicely in there. It was a bit of a formal decorative item as well. But then, like many things in modern history that we take cues from, the military was a big part of why that transition took place. In the wars, it was critical to be able to know the time, but not sensible to have something that you have to fumble around. And it was just so much more functional for it to be on the wrist, right? Sure. I think that was just one big driving reason, functionality. And the other thing was, wristwatches was just a decorative item, right? A piece of jewelry in the past. It was now necessary to also be able to measure that time accurately on the wrist as well. And I think today when we were talking about the IWC Portuguese, it's a nice example. There are obviously many examples, but a nice example to illustrate that journey from the pocket watch to the wristwatch.
Great, so today you're going to showcase your IWC, is that right?
See, before we go there, I think the Portuguese itself is a very interesting reference. IWC in the 1930s actually was struggling financially and they had to look for other markets. And they went to Portugal as one additional market, hence the name.
I've always wanted that.
So it's a bit of a strange one. And when they got to Portugal, two Portuguese businessmen came to them, a guy by the name of Rodrigues and Teixeira. And they basically came to IWC and said, hey, make me a wristwatch, but something that would be big and measure time extremely accurately. And at that time, wristwatches were already available, but it was more of a jewelry item, and measuring time accurately was not really a common thing, right? And what they ended up doing was, to fulfill that request, they had to go to the archives and find a pocket watch movement, because those were their most accurate movements. And as a consequence, it was a very big movement, and that was how the first Portuguese was born, and they launched that in the late 1930s. That reference, 325, was the first Portuguese, and it was made actually relatively small quantities all the way through to the 80s, and it was not very popular, and it was destined for a natural death essentially. The funny thing about watch history and stories is that you have many chapters that evolve, and in the early 90s, when the Portuguese had already died, a customer was visiting the IWC manufacturer in Switzerland, and they saw one of the legendary watchmakers in IWC, Kurt Klaus. He was wearing an original reference 325, and he was like, wow, that's a beautiful watch, tell me more a little bit about that. And they decided at that time, it was coming up to the 125th anniversary of IWC,
Yes.
and they should do a re-edition of the Portuguese. And in 1993, a reference 325 remake was born to commemorate that special occasion, and that model is now basically existed throughout until the present day.
That's fantastic. That's a great story. To me, to see how the evolution of it from the pocket watch from being the way to tell time for hundreds of years, then to a wristwatch was really fascinating. To me, it's great that IWC was brave enough to resurrect it and continue with it. And especially when they first came out with it, like you said, how large the watch was. And if you look at the watch design over the past 80 years, it wasn't really until maybe the past 20 years that they've become quite large in format. So for them to have the wherewithal to do this back in the 50s and then continue it, to me, it speaks volumes of, I would say, the bravery of the IWC or a team, but then also being able to have what I think is almost like a piece of design history in the IWC Portuguese is fantastic.
Yeah, David, they were probably 50 years ahead of their time. Like you were saying, wristwatches at that time were probably in the low 30s in size, in millimeters. And that reference 325 was in the 40s, right? It was a good solid 10 millimeters larger. And it preceded the big watch craze that was started by Panerai in the 90s. Amazing story.
Well, I'm curious, aside from wanting to have a kind of a little bit of a design history in the watch, what made you decide on the IWC Portuguese?
The other thing about importing the design or the mechanics of a pocket watch into a wristwatch, it had a lot of implications on the design, right? So I think if I just look at this modern reference here, firstly, it meant that the watch was big, right? And in today's world, it's nice. It was big, it was round, and that allowed a lot of real estate to put all the things that you want to measure in it. So I think that the design overall came out so nicely. And this here is a modern version, so it's not a manual wind watch, but it's an automatic. And IWC had updated it to all modern engineering. It's a 7-day automatic movement. But they retain a lot of the design elements, right? You've got a very big movement which they show you on the display case back. It's got all the similar type of things, like it's got the beautiful chapter ring, rail track design, beautiful Roman numerals here, 2 very nice registers for the seconds and for the power reserve, and then which is very nicely balanced, and the date in the middle there. So it brought very nice design elements into the watch, in addition to the history, right? I think that's a thing that makes me very excited about the IWC Portuguese as a watch, in addition to its history.
Great, that's fantastic. Well, to me, that was a really interesting story. Thanks, Ken, for sharing that. And for those watching today, I hope you found it interesting as well. If you liked what you heard today from us, please hit the like button and also subscribe. And as always, we're always keen to hear feedback from everyone. So please leave us some comments. And I would also ask that, in addition to what we could be doing better, but then also what watch do you want to see? Give us that suggestion in the comment, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for watching.
Bye.